Morning fog clung to the streets of Westlake, a quiet town in northern Oregon, on a late October morning in 2019. It was the kind of day etched in my mind, a haunting memory that refuses to fade, the kind of beginning that warns you something terrible is coming. I'm telling it now because some stories need to be told, no matter how hard they are to relive. The morning fog clung to the streets of Westlake, a quiet town in northern Oregon, pressing down with an unnatural stillness. The mist curled through the alleys and wrapped the buildings in its cold embrace. The faint chime of the church bell was swallowed by the fog, and the storefront windows reflected only pale, empty voids. Even the birds were silent, their usual morning calls replaced by an unsettling quiet. The riverbank was hidden in the haze, its waters slow and black beneath the old wooden docks. Shadows flickered at the edges of vision, where the line between reality and nightmare blurred. I remember that day as if it's been burned into my memory. The morning Lily Henshaw's body was found by the riverbank. The scene was surreal, as though time itself had fractured. The morning mist swirled around the flashing blue and red lights of the patrol cars, casting eerie halos. The discovery felt like a stone cast into still water, sending ripples of fear and grief through the town. Some gathered in stunned silence, clutching their coats against the cold, while others murmured prayers under their breath. The local police arrived quickly, their boots crunching against the gravel as they cordoned off the area, their radios crackling with instructions. The sound of camera shutters clicked in the background as officers documented the scene. Detective Harris, known for his unflinching demeanor and sharp eyes, led the investigation with an air of calm authority. He spoke in clipped tones, reassuring the gathered crowd while directing his team with the precision of someone who'd seen too many tragedies. But despite their efforts, interviews, searches, and theories, the case felt like a web that unraveled with each pull of the thread. Harris's notepad filled with questions that led nowhere. The police canvassed the town, knocking on doors and gathering stories that blurred together, but they questioned Caleb Winters first, of course. I remember the way people crowded the precinct steps, hoping for news and closure, their eyes darting with quiet desperation as they whispered to one another. They gathered in coats and scarves against the morning chill, murmuring theories and clinging to hope. When no arrests were made, the whispers began to grow louder, their shape darkening into a communal need for someone to blame, a fear that had curdled into suspicion. Faces grew tight with anger, eyes narrowed with distrust, and conversations in shops and cafes became laced with accusation. The precinct doors became a symbol of unanswered prayers, a place where truth had yet to surface and doubt festered. Each day without an arrest deepened the fractures in the town, turning neighbors into strangers and feeding the growing shadow of unease. Lily's pale hand stretched toward the sky, fingers stiff and frozen as if pleading for someone to pull her back from the abyss. The river whispered around her still form, its current slow and mournful, curling with dark ribbons as if trying to cradle her. The water lapped gently at the edges of the bank, carrying away the last vestiges of warmth from her life and trailing them downstream like a cruel elegy. Sunlight, fractured through the mist, dappled the surface with pale, broken reflections that flickered and died. Fallen leaves drifted by, their brittle forms brushing against her as though offering a final farewell, and the sound of the water was less a song and more a dirge or requiem for a life taken too soon. The news broke over the town like a shattered window, fragile piece obliterated in an instant, echoing like a single devastating bell. Westlake, with its quiet shops and afternoon porch talks, became a place of suspicion and terror overnight, as if an invisible plague had settled over the town. Doors that had once stayed unlocked were now bolted shut with trembling hands, windows latched with the caution of frightened hearts. Conversations became hushed, passing in quick, clipped tones, while eyes darted nervously over shoulders, wary of every shadow. The streets emptied before dusk, and even the usual clatter of bikes and footsteps of children vanished, replaced by an unnatural quiet that blanketed every corner. The once familiar sense of home had warped into something alien, and the town held its breath, waiting for the darkness to give up its secrets. And they all wanted a scapegoat. It didn't take long for the town to point fingers at Caleb Winters, Lily's boyfriend. People whispered about their arguments, their strained public encounters, their voices low but sharp as knives. Some claimed they had seen the way Caleb's fists clenched during an argument at the diner, how his eyes darkened when Lily walked away from him. They murmured that Caleb's temper had always been too sharp, his gaze too dark, a storm waiting to break. They spoke as if they had been witnesses to some hidden tragedy, piecing together scraps of rumor and turning them into a damning story. But they didn't see what I saw. A boy shattered by grief, drowning in accusations that cut deeper than knives. His shoulders sagged under the weight of whispers that followed him through every street. I remember catching glimpses of him through frost-covered windows, sitting alone in the corner booth of the diner where they used to meet, staring at his coffee as though it held answers he could never find. The world seemed to close in around him, inch by inch, as the town's judgment became a silent jury delivering a sentence before the truth was known. The days following Lily's death blurred into one long nightmare. The local diner was filled with quiet conversations, the weight of judgment hanging thick. I remember sitting there once, watching Caleb through the window. He was seated alone, staring blankly at his coffee as though the heat from the cup might melt his sorrow. Then one day, Caleb was gone. Disappeared without a trace. The search for truth ended when Caleb disappeared, leaving behind only more unanswered questions. I was left behind, caught in a fog of unanswered questions that seemed to wrap itself around my mind, just as the mist wrapped around the town. Each passing day felt heavier, weighed down by the unsaid and unknown. Every glance at Lily's old haunts, the diner, the library steps where we used to meet, only deepened the ache. It wasn't just grief. It was the kind of uncertainty that made time itself feel like a trap, looping endlessly around memories and what-ifs. I tried to bury myself in routine, but the fog lingered, a constant reminder of everything I didn't know, everything that was taken. Westlake was moving on, but I was still standing still, held in place by the same fog that seemed determined to smother any answers. A year passed like a slow poison. Lily's memorial at the river became weathered, the flowers faded and forgotten. But I never forgot. Then, on a crisp autumn night, I found an envelope in my mailbox unmarked, unassuming, yet as heavy with foreboding as a whispered curse. The envelope's edges were slightly crumpled, as if it had been handled nervously before being placed there. The street behind me was quiet, but in that moment, I could almost feel eyes watching from the shadows, as if the mist itself had conspired to deliver this message. I hesitated before opening it, my heart already thudding with an inexplicable sense of urgency and dread. You don't know the whole truth. Meet me at the old train station at midnight. I held the note in shaking hands, the words searing into my thoughts. My instincts screamed to throw it away. But beneath the fear was something else, a need. The need to know the truth. Midnight came too quickly. The old train station loomed before me, its rusted tracks stretching into oblivion. The place was a tomb of forgotten memories. The wind carried the scent of rust and damp wood, and the sound of the occasional drip echoed through the hollow station. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps on gravel. A figure emerged from the shadows, gaunt and unfamiliar at first, as though shaped by the mist itself. His silhouette was jagged, his frame hollow, and for a brief second, I thought he might be some fragment of memory come to life. But as he stepped into the moonlight, his features sharpened, and my breath caught in my throat. Caleb Winters. His face was pale beneath the dim glow, his cheeks sunken, and his eyes carried the weight of a year spent in the wilderness of guilt and desperation. He wasn't the boy I remembered. His face was hollow, with sunken eyes rimmed with shadows and cheekbones sharpened by hardship, catching the pale moonlight. His clothes hung loose, wrinkled and stained with travel, like a ghost wearing the remnants of another life. The way he stood rigid, but wavering at the edges, made him look like he might dissolve into the night itself. The wind tugged at the frayed edges of his jacket, and for a moment, I wondered if he was real or some tortured memory pulled from the mist. "Noah," Caleb whispered. "It's me." For a moment, I was frozen. The air was thick with disbelief. "You shouldn't be here," I said, my voice tight. "They think you killed her." "I know." Caleb's voice cracked. "But I didn't." He stepped closer, his gaze wild but pleading. "I've been chasing the truth, Noah. I found something, someone. The man who was there that night." My mind reeled as Caleb pulled out a crumpled photograph, a blurry figure at a gas station, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, his features just obscure enough to send a chill through me. The figure looked ordinary, mundane even, but there was something unsettling about the way he stood rigid, slightly angled as though listening for something. The grainy quality of the photo only made it more haunting, as if the edges of reality themselves had frayed. I leaned in, noticing a detail I hadn't expected. The reflection in the glass behind him, a smear of something human-shaped, blurred but present, as though he wasn't alone. The questions it raised made the night seem colder still. "The Watcher," Caleb muttered. "I saw him by the river the night she died." The cold night seemed to grow colder. "Why come to me?" I asked. Caleb's gaze hardened. "Because you were her best friend. If anyone knows what we missed, it's you." The weight of his words pressed against my chest. I felt the old grief stir, sharp and unbearable. But underneath it, a flicker of something else, determination. I nodded. "All right. Where do we start?" We hit the road that night, headlights slicing through the dense fog, casting faint shadows that melted away into the gloom. The journey felt endless, punctuated by long silences and the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt. Caleb had spent months chasing leads, motels, diners, gas stations, all tied together by one man's shadow. The dashboard light cast a dim greenish glow across his face, making the hollows beneath his eyes look even deeper. The hum of the engine filled the silence between us, but the tension sat like a heavy weight. I stole a glance at him, his hands gripping the wheel tight, knuckles white, as if steering was the only thing keeping him grounded. With each mile, I felt the walls close in, the spaces between familiar landscapes replaced by the desolation of long, empty roads. The world felt smaller, suffocating, with every passing signpost we didn't recognize. It wasn't just a search for the truth, it was an unraveling. We weren't chasing a man. It felt as if we were peeling back layers of the past, exposing wounds that still festered beneath the surface. We stopped at deserted gas stations and empty parking lots, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead flickering like dying stars. Every lead we followed added to the strain, our nerves frayed by the eerie stillness that clung to these forgotten places. In a dusty roadside diner, we found our first real break. The neon sign flickered, casting a faint glow over the worn countertops and buzzing faintly in the background. The place smelled of old coffee and fried grease, the kind of smell that clung to you long after you'd left. The waitress was wiping down the counter with slow, deliberate movements, her tired eyes flickering with recognition when she saw the photo Caleb slid across to her. Her gaze lingered on the grainy image, and the air between us seemed to thicken with an unspoken tension. "He always sat in the corner," she said, voice low and cautious, as though afraid the walls might overhear. "Never talked, but he watched everyone. Always ordered the same thing, black coffee, no sugar, and stayed longer than most." The hum of the diner's ceiling fan was the only sound for a moment as we absorbed her words. I glanced at Caleb, whose jaw clenched at the confirmation. She shifted her weight and leaned in slightly, lowering her voice even more. He used to watch the river sometimes from the window like he was waiting for something. The way she said it sent a chill down my spine, as though even she couldn't understand what she had seen. He always sat in the corner, she said, voice low. Never talked, but he watched everyone. My skin prickled. Caleb leaned forward. Do you remember where he was headed? She hesitated, then whispered, Miller's Rest Motel. By dawn, we reached the motel, its cracked sign swaying gently in the wind. The air was thick with dust and unease, hanging like a suffocating shroud over the empty parking lot. Room 12 stood silent and ominous, its door chipped and slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. The windows were covered with yellowed curtains that barely moved, as if hiding secrets from the world. Caleb's hand trembled as he reached for the handle, his knuckles pale against the tarnished brass. For a moment he hesitated, his breath shallow, as though he was bracing himself not just for what lay inside, but for the memories that might rush back with it. Inside, the room was chaos maps pinned to the walls, a knife glinting on the table, and a notebook filled with dates and names. At the bottom of one page was Lily's name, circled in red. My pulse thundered. He knew her. Caleb clenched his fists. We're close. But then, a low rumble, a car pulling into the lot. We looked out the window. A black SUV skidded to a stop. The man from the photo stepped out, taller and broader than I imagined, his face obscured by sunglasses. He's here, Caleb whispered. We bolted out the back door, adrenaline coursing through our veins. The man shouted after us, his footsteps pounding like war drums. The forest swallowed us in shadows and twisted roots. Branches clawed at our skin as we ran, lungs burning. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. The man's voice rang out, You can't hide forever. We stumbled into an old maintenance shed. Caleb slammed the door shut, pressing his weight against it. Through the cracks, I saw the man stop and listen. Minutes passed in strained silence. Then Caleb whispered, We have to move. The ranger's cabin was old but sturdy, its walls lined with old hunting plaques and forgotten photographs. We blocked the windows and locked the door. We need to call for help, I said. Caleb shook his head. No. He's too connected. He'll know. My heart sank. Before I could argue, the window shattered. The man burst in, rage like a storm. Caleb grabbed a tire iron, swinging with everything he had. They clashed like wolves in a death spiral. The man pinned Caleb, snarling. She wasn't supposed to fight. The words sent ice through my veins. With a surge of fury, I swung the broken chair leg with all my strength, the wood splintering on impact as a sharp crack echoed through the room. The man let out a grunt of pain, staggering as Caleb twisted free. Caleb's face was a mask of rage and desperation, and with a sudden fierce cry, he drove the tire iron into the man's shoulder with enough force to make him collapse to his knees. The struggle wasn't just physical, it was a desperate fight for justice, for survival, for everything we had lost. The police arrived moments later, their sirens piercing the stillness as blue and red lights flashed through the trees like beacons of hope. We later learned that a park ranger on patrol had noticed the commotion and called it in, after seeing the man's SUV parked suspiciously near the trail. Officers moved in quickly, their shouts cutting through the tension as they secured the area. The man was arrested without resistance, his silence unnerving as they cuffed him. In the following investigation, the truth began to surface. The man, identified as a drifter who had traveled across multiple states, was driven by a warped obsession with control. He saw his victims, including Lily, as people who had what he believed he had lost: happiness, belonging, and love. His journals were filled with twisted reflections, detailing how he chose his victims and justified his crimes as balancing the scales. The pages revealed a disturbing belief that he was bringing a kind of justice to the world, by removing illusions of peace. In his room, they found a trove of unsettling evidence journals detailing his movements, photographs of other victims, and enough proof to link him not only to Lily's murder, but to several other unsolved cases. The journals revealed his disturbing descent into darkness, where he meticulously recorded his motivations. He believed that his victims symbolized false happiness, that they lived lives he could never have. He saw himself as a force of balance, delivering what he called poetic justice to those who, in his twisted view, did not deserve peace. The weight of it all pressed down on us as the night slowly gave way to dawn, like a slow tide washing over everything. The officers moved with grim faces, collecting each shred of evidence while the forest seemed to exhale after the storm of chaos. Caleb and I stood by in silence, watching as they sealed away the remnants of a nightmare. And yet, deep down, we knew that while justice had been served, the scars of that night would linger far longer, etched into our lives like scars on weathered stone, memories that would never fully heal. As the morning light broke over the horizon, its soft glow touching the trees and riverbanks, we walked back to where Lily's memorial stood, flowers now withered and weather-beaten, but still present, like the memory of her that never faded. Caleb and I stood there in silence, the hum of the forest around us now strangely calm. I thought of her laugh, her quiet resilience, and how much light she had brought into our lives. I bent down and placed a new bouquet of lily at the base of the memorial, the petals still fresh with morning dew. "You deserved more," I whispered. Caleb closed his eyes, his face reflecting a pain too deep for words. In that quiet moment, I made a promise to remember her, not just as the tragedy that marked this town, but as the person she was. She wasn't just a story for headlines or an echo of fear. She was Lily, who once danced barefoot in the rain and dreamed of traveling far from this place. The river whispered as it always had, but now it seemed less mournful, carrying with it a soft, almost hopeful melody. "Rest easy," I murmured. "We found the truth. And we won't forget." Sometimes the only justice we can offer is remembrance. And in that moment, I knew Lily's memory would outlast the shadows that tried to claim it.